Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're in for a treat, and I get the honor of introducing the speaker, Dr. Abby Burke, or Professor Burke to me. She was one of my favorite professors at the University of San Diego. And even though I had her for online classes, they were very engaging, and I learned a lot in environmental management and business and society. So currently, Abby Burke is a professor of clinical professor of management at the School of Business at the University of San Diego. And she teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate business classes on corporate social responsibility, sustainability, with a particular focus on climate action and the Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Burke is also actively involved in environmental advocacy at the university and in the greater San Diego community. So a lot of knowledge, and we're definitely in for a treat today.
Great, thank you, Nick. So nice to see students still out there doing good things in the world. So I appreciate the introduction. And as you know, the theme for today is CDP, which is one of those many acronyms that doesn't seem to make sense, but we're going to walk through it today. So by the end of this evening, you'll certainly know what it is, why it's relevant, what it covers, how you might participate, and with time for Q&A. And full disclaimer here, I have no affiliation with CDP. I'm not paid. I'm not a consultant. They didn't bribe me to make this presentation. So this is actually just a genuine overview of what they are and why people in industry, but certainly in the supply chain, would want to know about CDP. Okay. I did get a chance to look through the ASCM standards for sustainability that Preston had mentioned earlier, and they do a great overview of sort of the general sustainability field, but I dug into the specific elements that dealt with ecological excellence, and I was pleased to see there was a lot of overlap and relevance with what's covered in the CDP. So I think you'll, as you dig into the ASCM standards, you'll see that the topics we're covering today are relevant within your own standards. So here we are, summer 2023 will go down as the summer of extreme heat. I know it sounds like we have some people attending from Texas, which certainly can relate to that. Our friends in Phoenix, I think they're counting, is it 21 days with excessive heat there? So certainly summer is going to be we're going to remember this summer. Hopefully it's, not an ongoing trend, but certainly forecast going into fall, it's going to continue. Which is ironic because summer is the time when people like to be outside. This is the opportunity when people are appreciating and enjoying our natural environment. So this is one of the most iconic spots. Maybe it looks familiar to some of you. Spent some time here. And I feature it because it includes both the wildlife. It doesn't have any people. That's a hard thing to find there, but it includes both wildlife, trees, water, air. And of course, this is our iconic Yellowstone National Park, which is certainly swamped with visitors at this time of year. Alternatively, many people venture outside to appreciate what nature has to offer at, I'm sure you recognize, Yosemite National Park. Again, an icon, a beacon that people are drawn to because of its beauty in nature. And then closer to home, maybe you recognize this locale. Maybe you've enjoyed a hike here with some people here. This is indeed Torrey Pines State Park. So even within the San Diego region, nature is what draws people and inspires people to connect and go outside. And that's an important premise because we want to re-understand that we're not talking in an abstract. Most people care about the environment. They appreciate it. There's even a recent Gallup poll that indicates that a very significant percentage in the US are worried about some aspect of the environment, whether or not it's air, water, pollution, climate change. We're not talking in a vacuum, right? People have different levels of worry, but that is something on many people's radar. But unfortunately, that leads to the prevalence of greenwashing, which I know you're all aware of, this idea of companies capitalizing on this concern to try and generate additional profits. Here's one of my favorite examples out there, which is quite comical because, of course, Companies preying on this idea that people have an aversion to plastic, and some savvy consumer actually thought to cut it open. And lo and behold, there is indeed plastic there. Probably one of the prime examples of greenwashing. But it takes all forms in terms of what's marketed to consumers, this idea of what's natural, what does that even mean? Does that actually add value? But consumer facing is certainly prevalent, but we see a lot of it within corporate communications. So, there's no shortage of examples you could pull up here, but here's Shell, obviously one of the world's major polluters, talking about the progress they're making in climate and how they're having a positive environmental impact. So how do we discern what's actually meaningful? What's actually a sign and indication of a genuine positive environmental impact? Those very questions lead to a whole plethora, an alphabet soup of potential indicators helping us assess companies' environmental performance. I'm sure you recognize most of these. I'm super impressed with ASCM's range of webinars that actually address a bunch of these. So they probably are familiar, but the more standards, the more ratings, the more tools creates more questions. What is actually meaningful? How can we assess if a company is actually having a positive environmental impact? And that's where I present CDP as a meaningful solution. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the acronym. I think it's been referenced in some of your prior presentations, but as a frame of reference, CDP is this global platform. It's a nonprofit, so that is important that its mission is focused on building a sustainable economy through the vehicle of a nonprofit. And it's been around since 2000. It started as the Climate Disclosure Project, hence the acronym CDP. But since 2000, they've expanded their purview, recognizing there's so many more environmental issues. So now they're known simply as CDP. And in recent years, they really have been considered the gold standard for environmental disclosure and environmental data. When a company tells you they're committed to the environment, the expectation is that they have utilized CDP to verify their environmental commitment. And what makes CDP so interesting is that it's a centralized disclosure platform that also evaluates companies' performance. So a lot of the reporting standards will tell you give guidance on what companies should report, but CDP not only presents what's relevant information, but then takes it the next step to evaluate how the company performs. And it's also selected to focus on 3 distinct areas: climate, forests, and water. Now, of course, these are not the only topics that are relevant, but this is where they have found the most material items for companies. And within these topics, climate addresses not only emissions, but also biodiversity and waste. Forest recognizes different areas of forest impact. And water, just new this year, just a few months ago, started adding questions about plastic. So CDP is not a static reporting environmental disclosure. It continues to evolve and add more topics of relevance. Now, we are good at reinventing the wheel. We do have all those different standards. Everybody likes to put their stamp on things, but CDP says, let's utilize the industry tools and standards that are out there. And so they have built their disclosure platform, taking into account the models developed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Science-Based Targets. They recently revised their questions, so they're in total alignment with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And they're currently aligning them with the forthcoming standards from ISSB. So if you prepare to comply with CDP, you have therefore also complied with the standards from these other industry tools. So the idea is to try and eliminate some redundancy, CDP being the overarching disclosure platform that will also fulfill other reporting requirements. And they gather so much data that now it becomes a centralized resource for a large quantity of corporate environmental information. This is what NGOs are using. These are what business communities, certainly in academics, we love to access CDP data for research, government policies looking at this information, and certainly the finance industry, all kinds of investors and ratings agencies. So CDP data is a hot commodity. Everybody realize this is the centralized aggregated environmental data. Okay, so who's in CDP? It was created for companies, public, private, large, small, medium, but it's expanded based on its popularity. And now CDP also aggregates data for cities, governments, states, and public authorities. So the city of San Diego is in the process of complying with CDP, as is the state of California. We have Sandag, the Port Authority, the airport, all those kind of public authorities are also being drawn to the solutions provided by CDP. But today we are going to focus specifically on the corporate, the company piece, because it is slightly different for some of these other reporters. What makes CDP different from so many of the other reporting standards is it's driven by two key entities, investors and purchasers. So CDP just doesn't leave it up to companies to say, I want to report. It's driven by investors and supply chain purchasers that say, we want this information from our companies we work with. So the driving force are these two entities. Now, companies can also choose to disclose, but most of the submissions and the compliance with CDP comes on behalf of investors and purchasers. So more specifically here, the investor members of CDP, right now there's about 746 of them who manage a colossal volume of assets. We're talking hundreds of trillions in assets. These are your big names, your JP Morgan, your Wells Fargo, your Bank of America. These investors use through CDP, they request data from the companies that they invest in, or they're interested in investing in, or they have some financial relationship with. So CDP says, we want to know more about the environmental impacts of the companies we are financially committed to. So 18,500 companies get a request saying your investors want to know how you're doing. The second vein is the supply chain. Here we have about 340 of the largest purchasers with trillions of procurement spend. Some examples here, obviously Walmart, Boeing. And these purchasers through CDP send a request to 47,000 suppliers saying, we want to know what's your environmental impact. So these are the drivers of CDP generating such an extensive environmental database. So in total, CDP sends out approximately 50,000 requests in the most recent year to companies that have been identified by investors and purchasers, and they get an invitation saying, we'd like you to disclose. And most recently, over 18,000 of these companies disclosed in response to this request. Again, this is global, so we look at about 3,700 companies that disclosed in the United States. And once they disclose this information to CDP, it gets shared back with the requester. So that investor, that purchaser, now has insight into the environmental impact of their designated responders. It's all about transparency here. Now, this request to disclose, it's not just a casual side note. There's actually an official request sent to the board of directors. So they actually get a letter, an actual piece of paper in the mail. I know, shocking. They actually get a letter addressed to the board of directors and an email informing them that they have been requested to disclose through CDP. So they should know what's happening. Whether or not how they choose to respond is another story. But this idea of requesting information is gaining a lot of traction. You might be familiar with this headline from a few months ago, when the federal government said that they are implementing a new requirement for all federal suppliers to say they have to disclose environmental data through CDP. This is a massive implication for the importance and the relevance of CDP. Obviously, the federal government is the largest purchaser in the world, thousands and thousands of suppliers. So anybody considered major, more than $7.5 million in spend, expected by about 2025 is going to be required to submit through CDP. So this is coming in the pipeline, especially in San Diego. We have a lot of companies that have some federal contracts with the military. This is going to be inevitable in the near future. And it indicates a trend that suppliers, the supply chain is being called in by purchasers. You may have seen this in the news just last week, that Amazon said as of next year, they are also going to require all of their suppliers to report emissions and set climate goals. So now we're seeing this trend of where the demand is coming from. Now, Amazon's report was very brief. It didn't have a lot of details. We don't know if they're going to be using CDP or what reporting standard, but it is an indication of this environmental disclosure is coming down the pipeline, and suppliers as part of the supply chain, this is going to be a requirement going forward. So everybody's getting an invitation. They have a choice whether or not they participate. So CDP does some extensive work trying to convince companies of the benefits of disclosing environmental impact with CDP. And of course, the benefits are you're appeasing your investors, you're communicating with your stakeholders, there's risk management, identifying opportunities. If you disclose through CDP, you've met the requirements for all the other reporting standards. So there's a lot of work trying to convince companies to go through this process, convincing them of the benefits to the business. But fundamentally, companies also say when they do this, this actually motivates the company to take environmental action. Ultimately, that's our goal, positive environmental impact. Disclosure is a way to motivate that kind of behavior. Okay, so what does it look like? You got an invitation, you have agreed, you're like, okay, I understand the benefits. I'm going to be part of CDP. CDP actually has disclosure in 3 different areas: climate, forests, and water. A company can get a request for 1, 2, or all 3 of these areas. Climate, being the origin of CDP, being the longest one, has the most requests and responders. So this is where we see the most significant numbers. About almost 19,000 responders completing the climate questionnaire. The most recent version has 130 questions. Forest questionnaire is much smaller, 80 questions, but way fewer companies are actually requested to complete the forest questionnaire. And somewhere in the middle there, we see the water questionnaire has, approaching 4,000 responders, and it is again detailed with approximately 85 questions. So this is not a small commitment. In addition, if your company is part of what's considered a high impact sector, there are sometimes additional questions in addition to the questions outlined that pertain specifically to impact within your industry. So for example, it makes sense. You can see in the energy industry, a coal company is going to have some more questions about deforestation. So when you go to complete this disclosure, complete these questionnaires, it's all online. Again, this is one of the attributes of CDP. It provides centralized data. So when you're going through the process of completing, it's an online data entry, both qualitative and quantitative. And unlike some other reporting standards, you can't just send them a link to your corporate sustainability report. You can't attach a PDF. Every question needs to have content entered. So it is a time-consuming process, and you can't leave a blank. You're going to be penalized for blank. If you don't have a program that they're asking about, they want you to respond, we don't currently have this program. So the online response system is what aggregates and collects all the data. And these questions are revised annually. Every year, about 70% of the questions are the same, but CDP continues to evolve their questionnaires to reflect current interests. So some examples. Everybody wants to know, well, what do these questions look like? So within the climate questionnaire, some examples are the quantitative question asks, give me a number. What are your emissions? Scope 1, Scope 2, increasingly Scope 3. So this is a data point input here. And give me a percentage. How much are you spending on energy? So these are just examples of the 100+ questions. Quantitative. Qualitative, most questions are qualitative. They ask for descriptions, details, describe your process, provide information. I did include this qualitative question here because almost every questionnaire asks, who's the highest level person with responsibility for these issues? Are we seeing it at the C-suite? Are we seeing it in the board? Has it reached that high level of management attention? So climate, quantitative, qualitative. The same with forests. Again, they might be asking for a specific number. What percentage of your revenue is dependent on forest risks? What percentage of your forest production is certified? So again, looking for specific data to complement the qualitative descriptions about your risks and your approaches and how it impacts your organization. Water, same trend. We're looking for quantitative data. So sometimes this is easier to find, especially if you're purchasing, but it needs to always be complemented by qualitative data, talking about what are your details, how are you doing this, how are you working with suppliers. And as I mentioned, for this year, new within the water questionnaire is a section on plastics. Obviously getting a lot more attention globally, so relevant to incorporate. And here they're looking for the total weight of plastic goods and what kind of plastic risks, as well as some circularity of plastic packaging. So hopefully you get an idea if there's both the quantitative and qualitative data among each of these areas. Once you've answered all the questions, there's one more important question that causes lots of deliberation. And it's what level of visibility do you want for your CDP response? And your options are public or non-public. Either way, no matter what you select, your response is going to be shared with the organization that requested the data from you. The difference is it publicly available? Is it published on the CDP website, or is it something just between you, CDP, and the requester? Now, CDP is a big believer in transparency. We want to learn from other peers in our industry, so they highly encourage it to be a public response. And in fact, that's actually a requirement if you want to get a top score. But not every company is ready to have this level of detail public. So that's one of your final questions, right? This is what a sort of a snapshot of what a public response might look like. Here's Microsoft. They put it on their own website. It's available on CDP. It's like a 250 plus page report. So nobody's reading it front to back for sure. But the idea is the information is out there, transparency, it's publicly available. So once you've determined if it's public, you do the click submit, it goes off. You don't see it again for several months because your submission is reviewed by the CDP scoring team. They have both people within the organization and external partners they've trained that spend several months reviewing. Again, remember all those qualitative, descriptive questions. Yep, those scoring partners are looking through them. It's an actual person, it's not AI, it's not automated, trying to provide an evaluation of this company's environmental impact. And after a couple months, you get an email, your score has arrived. And just like being back in school, you get an A or an F or somewhere in between. It usually comes out about mid-December, and each questionnaire gets scored separately. And those scores are listed on the CDP website. In a minute, we're going to go look at some scores, right? But as in school, everybody wants an A, nobody's happy with a C or a D, right? The idea is to try and motivate companies to move forward and get a higher grade in future submissions. So a little bit detail about what it means to have an A, B, C, or D, or F. An F, I say, if you don't turn in your homework, you get a 0. Same applies. An F is failing to provide information. It's been requested and the company chose not to respond. Even though it's been requested, you're going to get an F. It doesn't necessarily mean they have a negative environmental impact. It means they didn't provide the data to be evaluated. So we'll look in a minute. The majority of respondents that are requested get an F. Of those that submit, you can see almost 60% get a C or a D. This is a tough standard. Students would revolt if I had this kind of a grade distribution in a class, right? But it's a tough one in CDP. To get a D, disclosure means you're providing information. That's all that's entailed there. If you already disclose and now you're talking about your risks to the company and you have some awareness about what it means for your business, then you start to be in the C grade range. Beyond that, if you're actually taking steps to proactively manage your risks and manage your environmental impact, you'll be in the B range. And only a very few small number of submissions actually earn an A, which says you're really leading your industry and doing cutting edge actions to minimize your environmental impact. So very few A's. And one of the requirements for an A is that you are willing to make your response public so everybody can see what you're doing. So when you get your email back in December with your score, it not only does it give you just your overall letter, it gives you some benchmarking and some comparative information. So you have details on how you performed in different areas so that you can continue to focus on getting better going forward. So as I mentioned, over 18,000 responders, 330 earned an A. That's a tough score. You can see the breakdown here. We know the majority of responders were in the climate area, so we see almost 300 A's, and we see a much smaller number in forestry and in water. 12 companies, only 12, earned an A in all three categories. HP is one of the US companies that actually earned this AAA. L'Oreal is one of the longtime companies that's been successful in earning A's in all areas. So we have cosmetics, we have LVMH, luxury goods and items, Danone, a food company, and you might be interested to see Philip Morris International on this list. That usually raises some eyebrows. As CDP is measuring environmental impact, Philip Morris, of course, is the tobacco company selling cigarettes. So a total sustainability score would be looking at their social impact, but CDP is just looking at environmental impact, where they put a lot of efforts and earned a AAA. So how do you get an A? How do you get to be one of those top performing students? Nick would know all about this, right? Is to get the minimum criteria to get an A is you must disclose your emissions and verify at least your scope 1 and 2 emissions. You have to have a net zero target. You have to have a 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned climate transition plan, obviously aligned with Paris, and you have to have a science-based target. These are the minimum requirements to even be eligible for an A. But in all these questionnaires, there's also a minimum requirement that you engage with suppliers. Companies know that if they want to do well, they have to have this level of engagement with their suppliers, right? And some examples of companies that excelled in the climate area are Adobe, Technology, VF Corporation, textiles, and retail. So it can be done, but again, this is a very high standard. Now, CDP's A list has such credibility that there's actually a Swiss company that has created a stock market index called the Global Climate Change Leaders. And the companies included in the Global Climate Change Leaders are the CDP A list. And this stocks index, you can see, has been around for a little over a decade, and it tracks the performance of these climate leaders with a general index and gives some indication that these are some well-run businesses. They are strong climate performers and they're strong stock market performance as well. So CDP has enough credibility that that's the criteria to be included in this index. Now, we also have companies aspiring for the A list of forestry. Again, there's a lot about having access to your data, having procedures, having a strategic plan, and again, engaging with suppliers. We'll see Unilever and Essity. These are both products, manufacturing companies that are very paper dependent. So it makes sense that they would have been requested to complete the forestry questionnaire, and they have completed to the level such that they earned an A. Moving on to water, same kind of criteria. You're tracking your data, you're reducing your impact, you're managing it internally, engaging with suppliers. And we see some different names here. Who's earned an A for water? We have Anheuser-Busch, which is in the news for so many reasons, but I'll give them kudos for being in the news for water. Obviously, beer being predominantly made with water, and Caesars Entertainment. Perhaps you're thinking of Caesar's Palace in Vegas with all those water fountains. Well, yes, part of their business. they've managed it such that they earned a top score for water. And companies can be very proud of their score. This is Capgemini, a consulting company that is showing to the world, look at us, we got an A on climate. We're one of the very few. You even have this is a healthcare communications company out of the UK that is so proud they got a B, right? For the first time responding. So they recognize that's a big accomplishment. You have some auto manufacturers, again, they're selective on what they report, but if they get an A in one of these topics, they're going to tell everybody about it, right? Of course, their requester, the investors and the purchasers are going to know, but this is where they want to be publicly recognized. And oh, wow, kudos for getting 2 A's, right? So the Stanley Black & Decker is very proud and promotes that they have 2 A's in both the climate and water categories. So I thought it might be interesting to pull up some local companies to see how we think they're going to be scored based on their environmental disclosure through CDP. So I'm sure many of you in San Diego are familiar with Qualcomm. It's an incredible company who has a really strong commitment to social responsibility. And they have an extensive report outlining their ESG performance. And CDP evaluated their score as a B for climate and a B for water. Forest was not requested. They did not submit, so they don't have a score. But again, we know a B is a big accomplishment. So again, when you're reading a company's report, it's hard to discern how does this compare? Is it meaningful? CDP gives you an assessment, so you're not just relying on self-reported evaluations. So Qualcomm, well done. Here we have Illumina. Again, very committed to corporate social responsibility. They were only requested to complete in the climate area. And in 2022, the most recent data, they earned an A-, which obviously is quite commendable, especially when you look back at their historical performance. In 2021, they had a B, and in 2020, they had a C, which indicates they've made a commitment, they've made progress, and they're improving their performance. So well done to Illumina. WD-40, again, you may be familiar with the local company, and they make a lot of, they have a big commitment to their environmental, social, and governance impact. And they have an extensive report that details their initiatives. They were requested to respond to climate and forests, but they chose not to respond. And as we know, if you don't turn it in, you get an F. So again, an F is not an assessment of the environmental impact. An F indicates data was requested, they did not comply. But they have some pretty good company. Tesla, which everybody loves to think of as an environmental leader. And again, they've had a tremendous impact in terms of consumer product, but the CDP is looking at how they operate. And they were, of course, requested in all 3 categories. And maybe you're surprised, maybe you're not, chose not to respond. So Tesla, an environmental leader, but has Fs across the board from CDP. And like I said, this unfortunately is the norm. Of the 50,000 plus companies that are requested, we see around 30,000 just say, we're not ready, we're not going to do this, we're not going to respond, even though our investors and our partners have requested it, and therefore they earn an F. Nobody likes Fs. But again, you can see a range of industries. Zoom, I had to put Zoom on there because, you know, we're supporting Zoom right now. Berkshire Hathaway, investment, Wynn Resorts, we see in contrast to Caesar and Caesars and 7-Eleven, all sorts of industries. It's not specific to one industry, one size. A lot of companies are intimidated and do not respond. Now, I want to acknowledge that CDP has put a lot of attention around the importance of the supply chain. You all know this data, of course, but the supply chain is the majority of a company's environmental impact, whether it's emissions, water, forestry, biodiversity. The majority of the impact comes when you take into account suppliers. So CDP has dug into it a little bit more about how do we engage suppliers in this platform. And in particular, this is from the prior year, they found that most companies were not even engaging with suppliers. Even if they're requesting this data, they hadn't been engaging to help suppliers reach a higher standard. So we see based on the 3 different questionnaires here, across the board, less than half of companies were actively engaging with suppliers to help them both recognize the importance and make progress. In response, CDP has tried to recognize companies that are leaders in terms of supplier engagement. So regardless of what their company's score is, companies that have a strong supplier engagement are eligible to be included on the leaderboard. And you can see some examples of companies here that then get recognized for their commitment to their suppliers. CDP is also engaged in some research focused on the supply chain. So just last year, they came out with a report in partnership with Boston Consulting Group, looking at the supplier data that they have in depth within their database. So they're putting a lot of attention on the supply chain, recognizing that's where a lot of the impetus is coming, whether or not it's the federal government, whether or not it's Amazon, the supply chain will be driving a lot of future adoption. So at some point you might be wondering, all right, this sounds very expensive. Well, there is a cost, but it depends on where the request comes from. So if the request to disclose comes from an investor, a responder does have to pay the administrative fee, somewhere between $3,000 and almost $7,000. But if the request comes from the part of the supply chain, then the requester actually absorbs that fee. So if it's Walmart requesting from their suppliers, they pay and the individual suppliers do not. So there's an admin fee. But I'm sure you're aware and thinking that really the most significant cost is the time and the human capital required to complete this disclosure. So the administrative fee, you want to be aware that it's out there, but reality, that's probably not the biggest cost hurdle to completion. Okay, if I didn't scare you enough, I'm hoping at some point some of you are thinking, okay, I recognize it's coming. I want to get started. I want to be a discloser through CDP. So what does this process look like? So the first is CDP prides himself on transparency, and anybody can set up a free online account. You can do it today. You can do it as an individual, and if you end up being a reporter for your company, you can be added to their account, but anybody is eligible to register for an online account and have access to a large amount of data they provide online. But you also want to understand the timeline. So CDP works on a calendar year. So every year, early January, the latest questionnaire is published. Like I said, about 70% of the questions around there are the same from year to year, but that means there's a significant percentage that vary each year. So as of January, everybody can go online and look at these questionnaires in climate, forest, and water. You have a couple months to check them out. By March, the official requests are sent out. So those 50,000 companies get a request from CDP saying somebody's looking at asking for your environmental data. So you can start actually opening it up and completing the online response system in April. And during that April summer timeframe, spring summer timeframe, CDP hosts a large number of workshops, webinars, publishes information to try and help support those disclosing. It does take a couple months, April, May, June, and the submission date is July. Now, the submission date for 2023 is tomorrow, the 26th. So if you haven't started, you're probably going to miss the deadline. But typically, the submission deadline is by the end of July, which gives the scoring team time to review all those detailed responses by the end of the year. So you get your score by end of year, ready to start the next cycle again in January. I mentioned they put a lot of information online. They're easily downloadable. I can send links, but you can certainly find historical and the most current questionnaires with excruciating detail, not only the questions, but the different responses, options, the different frameworks they align with. If it's TCFD, if it's the GRI, Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see how they have gotten to all these questions. And they also add a pretty detailed report explaining how they're going to score your questions. So transparency is really critical because we want companies to succeed. We want companies to be doing the right thing. Now, I'm sure you're thinking this sounds like a Herculean task to complete all these data, and it is. So certainly being a disclosure would require engaging with multiple stakeholders within your organization, as well as suppliers and externally. So this is not a one-person job. I don't think anybody has all this information at their fingertips. So recognizing it's a multiple stakeholder process and recognizing this is likely a multi-year commitment. Every year the questionnaire modifies, every year it's added, more data is expected. So this, if you're getting management buy-in, it's certainly planned for multi-year process when you'll continue to refine and enhance your responses. Now, there is a little bonus if you're the first-time responder, because some companies are intimidated. And if you're choosing to respond for the first time, you have a couple of we'll call them perks. And there's one option to respond to a minimum version of the questionnaire versus the full questionnaire. So there's still data required. It's still indicative of your environmental impact. But if the full questionnaire is too intimidating, a first-time responder can choose to respond to a minimum questionnaire. You won't get a score, but you'll start gathering the data, so you'll be prepared for future years. If you're a first-time responder, you can also choose to keep your score private. So nobody can see. You're not like Tesla that got Fs, right? Nobody can see your score if you choose to keep it private as a first-time responder. And as mentioned previously, all responders can also elect to keep their responses private, which is different from your score. But again, you could choose to respond to get some familiarity with the disclosure questionnaire without having the pressure of public scores and public responses. CDP provides a lot of resources to help. So they're out there. Certainly, if you have an account, you have access to more. But even in preparing for this presentation, I've looked at their documents, extensive knowledge articles, publications. This is where you'll find the list of workshops, webinars that are recorded or live, just like this one, as well as guidance breaking down the questions for each of the questionnaires. So they have a support center as well, but I'm impressed with the extent of help and resources they provide to guide disclosure. And if that's not enough, there is another resource, because CDP recognizes this can be an extensive process. So CDP actually has identified partners out there that they call their accredited solutions providers. These are consultants that are brought on to help companies, certainly with their initial disclosure and going forward. So there's hundreds of them globally. There's over 66 in the United States. And some of these will be familiar consulting names, but they have been accredited as familiar with CDP disclosure. And companies that work with these providers tend to score higher because they have this guidance. So as I wrap up here, I just want to reiterate how important this CDP can be in driving companies to have a more positive environmental impact. So maybe you're familiar with Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the United Nations, but he was one of the biggest advocates of CDP, saying these tools are crucial to success in business. Nobody else is doing what CDP is doing. There's lots of standards, there's lots of frameworks, but CDP not only establishes the questions, but they also collect them, evaluate them, and make them publicly available. So this is taking environmental disclosure to the next level, hoping it drives further environmental impact. Because ultimately, that's what we're striving for, not just a report. Ultimately, we're striving for companies benefiting, helping our planet continue to thrive. So I encourage you here, don't wait. I know CDP sounds like it's a big task. It is, I'm not going to undersell it, but I think you have an indication that it's likely forthcoming, whether or not it's through an investor, through the government, contractors, suppliers. In your company's near future, you're likely to see a request for CDP. So if you start that process now, before it's mandated, you'll be well situated when you are being requested to disclose and your partners are looking at your performance to evaluate how you're doing. So don't wait, not only for your business sake, but also don't wait because the planet needs action now. And as we saw, companies that disclose with CDP are also more likely to take those positive action steps. So I want to thank you for being here. I realize I was probably standing between you and dinner and you and a lovely evening out. So thank you for being here. It was a pleasure to be part of your webinar, and I will gladly open it up to any Q&A questions that I might be able to answer about CDP and why it's relevant.
Hi, I'm Sandy Friedman, and I'm going to be administering the question and answer part of today. Thank you, Dr. Berg, for a very interesting lecture. Deanna had her hand up first. Deanna, why don't you ask your question? And you're on mute.
There's so many questions. So there's a governing body, or how is the CDP structured there?
It is. So CDP is its own entity. It's a nonprofit. It's headquartered in London, but they have their US headquarters are in New York, and they have offices around the world. But they have a staff and a team who work full time, not only with the investors and the purchasers, but with revising the standards and the questionnaires. But they do, as I mentioned, work extensively with the other standards out there. So they work with TCFD, and they're always in contact with the different industries. So whenever you see a consortium of people refining standards, CDP is part of that. But funnily, they are a standalone business, so they actually have employees that are focused on their tools.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I was curious in particular about the auditing process for the data that is submitted, particularly about quantitative. I'm curious if you can speak at all to how that quantitative data is verified. Also had like a curiosity, especially around the qualitative, are they doing on-site visits, or is this all just folks that are remote trusting that the data is valid that is submitted?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's very relevant for all reporting standards. This CDP data is self-reported. So CDP does not have an auditing process. They're not going on site. They're not cross-checking with other data. The only data point that is independently verified is for companies that commit to a science-based target for their climate alignment. But other than SBTI, it is based on what the companies respond. So that is a challenge, of course, but as they continue to grow their disclosure, that would be a challenge to have any direct auditing, but currently we're trusting.
Great, thank you.
Peter, you're next.
Thanks, Sandy. So I got a little bit of familiarity with the CDP. But a question, we work with something called the SCORE model, which has a component called green score, which we've been trying to bring to sort of the current world. It was originally designed around air standards maybe 20 years ago. And do you guys ever work with anyone on sort of incorporating your process and standards into other frameworks and models?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, I'm not part of CDP. I just, sort of work in the sustainability field. They do work pretty extensively with different reporting frameworks out there. CDP tends to view themselves as the overarching umbrella because they tend to be the most detailed and require the most data. So that's like they find that if you're, if you're SASB or TCFD, those questions align. They're part of what CDP covers. So I'm not, I can admit I'm not super familiar with your score criteria. I'm sure there is some overlap, but CDP probably has more questions and requires more data and detail, but hopefully there is some synergy there.
Anything else, Peter?
I had a question, Sandy. I was curious, Professor, if you had any thoughts on how the CDP looks at different industries, and maybe, I don't know if that would come down to the experts or internal CDP employees who review the submissions, because I mean, if you're looking at a service industry company versus oil or manufacturing, that's going to be very different. And I'd assume one could be rated A and still have a large negative impact, but be doing good things for the industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's only in recent years. So CDP has been around since 2000, but only more recently did they introduce this idea of high impact sectors. So they used to pride themselves on having a consistent questionnaire that allowed for comparison. But more recently, they've recognized there are some industry significant variables. So certain industries are given sort of additional questions. And as you referenced, of course, like comparing across industries is challenging. So leaders are within industries. So it's because, again, you could, hard to compare a services company to a mining manufacturing company. So industry is increasingly playing a role. They're trying to balance this idea of standardization. So you have one tool while recognizing their different impacts depending on your industry. So it is certainly coming into play.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Anna Rose, do you have another question?
Yeah, I do. One of the things that I was curious about is, so once you participate in CDP, it seems somewhat implied as you were talking about some companies that, resubmitted year after year. Is there a requirement in order to maintain your rating to resubmit data yearly? Or is it once you submit once, that's really your requirement and your grade, unless if you want to improve and potentially get a better score?
Yeah, great question. It's a grade for 1 year. So if you're an A for 2022. So there are companies that have been an A 3-4 years in a row, and the next year they fall down to an A- or a B. So if you choose not to disclose from 1 year to the next, you probably would get an F, because if you've already responded, you likely had a request. But it is a 1 year grade. So you got to keeping your GPA up. You got to keep turning in the homework.
Great, thank you.
Peter, did you have another question? Your hand is still up.
Sorry, Sandy, no, I'll take.
Okay, anybody else have any questions?
I do have a question.
ahead,
So
Brad.
that admin fee, is that a recurring thing yearly as well?
It is. And again, it's only applies if you have been requested by an investor. So if you're part of the supply chain program, you're not responsible for that. But yes, that is an annual fee that not only gives you a score, it gives you access to a little more data and resources. So they're trying to do some value add, but that is like basically how they're covering their costs as a nonprofit, covering their costs for creating the tool.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Preston, you're next.
Yeah, it's actually just responding to the question about someone dropping, out of the picture. They're an A 1 year and all of a sudden they go away. The ones that would really notice that are probably the investors, right? Because they would be suspicious. They're driving part of this process. I mean, when you control $135 trillion in investment money, you're very serious. So I suspect that it would be suspicious. I understand from comments that have been made to me, and again, I have never had the benefit of being a member, joining CDP or subscribing to it, that the investors are looking for people who are organizations who are working their way up. They don't expect everybody to be perfect, but they want to see the progress year in, year out as they move forward. So I think someone reporting for 2 or 3 years and suddenly dropping out would be very suspicious to the investor community. But that's just my Sherlock Holmes thinking that's probably gotten in the way.
Yeah, you're right. And we don't yet have examples of investors saying, we're only going to invest if you have a C or higher, or we don't yet have companies saying, we're going to cut you as a supplier unless you have a B. So we haven't sort of used the grades to that yet, but that is an anticipation as you have more and more that, investors, they could be using that information. It's all part of their risk assessment. So it certainly will continue in importance.
I have another question related to that, actually. What sort of considerations or contingencies might there be for companies to report honestly if the consequence of having a low grade is being rejected by these companies? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Brad, what a good question, right? That's sort of true with all sustainability reporting, right? How do we incentivize correct behavior or honest behavior? You know, in the absence of some sort of verification, certainly when you have an actual scoring team looking at data, aberrations of trends would stand out, right? So if you're reducing your emissions a certain amount and all of a sudden you claim to have a dramatic reduction without an explanation of strategy, that could raise some questions. And during that scoring period, there can be some follow-up. The scoring partners can reach out and ask for clarification. But yeah, it's a great question. How do you align incentives with the actual desired behavior? You know, fundamentally, we want to reduce the environmental impact, right? So we want companies to do it, not just tell us they're doing it. So that will continue to be an issue for sure.
Any other questions? If not, I have one, if I could ask. Just a curiosity, it looks like we're talking mainly about publicly held firms, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And obviously investors are interested in the performance of publicly held firms. But there's a lot of privately held firms that are either a primary provider or a supplier to other companies. How do they fit in to the CDP questionnaire and the whole effort?
Yeah, great question. Originally, this was focused on privately held, but there's actually a lot of publicly traded, but there are a lot of privately held companies that do participate in CDP. So that's not a requirement that you're public. You know, there are some questions about governance and the role of your board that might pertain more to public, but if the supply chain member asks for a supply chain response from a privately held company, that is not a CDP delineation. And they're seeing more and more of private companies and small and medium-sized companies participating. So sort of the genesis of it came from publicly traded, but that doesn't seem to be a delimiter one way or the other. So you're seeing private companies are now being held to these same standards. And, you know, they don't have as many of the external pressures. So this would be probably a really big hurdle for a private company to start making this kind of disclosure.
Very good. The reason I ask is that there's a lot of musical instrument companies in the United States that are privately held. One in particular is located right here in San Diego, and that particular company has taken a leadership role in sustainable harvesting of ebony woods. And they are the leader of doing that in a sustainable fashion. Consequently, there's another company, a famous company located in Nashville, that was cited about 10 to 15 years ago for not harvesting wood sustainably, or at least not documenting it. And they were fined significantly for doing that. That was about 10 or 15 years ago. No names. So I was just curious how that,
yeah. Well, again,
I was just curious how that fit in.
Yeah. You know, if they were to request, it seems like they would be requested for forestry, you know, maybe as long as other elements. So, you know, it hasn't come yet, but it doesn't mean that isn't, you know, imminent, especially with, as you know, SEC requirement, disclosure requirement forthcoming. It's just sort of the pervasiveness is going to start to, you know, go into all these industries and different size and ownership of companies. Yeah. Good examples.
Well, thank you very much. Anybody else have any questions?
Just to play devil's advocate for the interest of conversation, say lobbyists turn the tide away from people wanting to disclose or something like that, you know, like let's just go down that rabbit hole. Is there still value to people self-reporting and not aggregating all this data in totality, you know, in terms of what measurable progress can we still achieve if we don't all buy into this system that's happening for this, you know, like with that end goal? Because it does seem to be a self-reported, everyone join in, and it comes from creating that library of information and making those types of decisions. But kind of in that scenario, is it still possible to feel good and positive, I guess, about certain progress we can make with those who do buy in?
I love that vision, right? That we don't need this sort of pressure and this accountability to drive companies to do the right thing. So, you know, it's a great question. Because CDP, like how they differentiate themselves versus like a GRI or some of the other sort of tools out there, is because they do evaluate, they do put a score on it. And as you mentioned, it's this collective centralized way to compare. So that, that's part of why they've gotten such traction, is that's considered value add for the investors and the purchasers, but it's certainly not an indication of being the only companies that are having a positive impact. And that's ultimately what we're aspiring towards. So if this is a tool that helps some companies get there, then, we can ride that wagon, but it's certainly not every company needs that. In San Diego, we have Dr. Bronner's, a really a true commitment to all sustainability, and they're not a part of this. So they, it hasn't been requested of them. It's not a choice. It's certainly not the only indication of a company having a positive environmental impact. So I hope you're right that we don't need this public accountability and sort of public shaming or naming of leaders, but so far it seems to have been driving a lot of progress.
All right, anybody else? More hands are coming up. Brian, did you have another question?
Oh, no, sorry. That was just a thumbs up. And thank you,
Okay.
Natalie, for the response.
Preston, did you have another question?
Yeah, I just what's being overlooked is states and governmental entities. They're also in play, and they're using, in addition to the investors, they're using the CDP to give them insights into all the companies that they may contract with. And plus, I'm sure that it plays well with the federal government when state governments or cities within a state ask for money, investment from the federal budget. One hint that that's the case really is the fact that the government has said they want reporting through CDP, right? Of all the companies that contract with them. So there's there's all kinds of pressures from different directions going on right now. It's even with the Fed. The Fed is actually looking at the 5 largest banks, and they're engaged in a pilot program of trying to understand how to evaluate environmental risk and invest or provide loans based on that. That's part of the equation. So it's just what's happening right now is coming from everyone at all angles. And I think that's what Professor Beck stated, but more clinical terms, more straightforward terms. If you don't comply shortly, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah. It's why it's the reporting standard you need to know, because it's going to come on your desk and come across your desk at some point, and you want to be prepared.
All right, anything else? You mentioned City of San Diego as being part of CDP. And when I worked at CGI, I was PMO manager, project manager, program manager, and City of San Diego was our largest client. And my favorite projects, my largest projects, were in the environmental services division. So I can see how they could be involved with that. And San Diego is one of the more forward-looking cities out there. One reason why I'm living here, but just one other maybe comical note. When I worked at CGI, one of my clients was also WD-40, and we put in their very first ERP system. And I'm not surprised that they got an F, because I look at their whole supply chain. Most of their emissions are scope 3, from the suppliers all the way out to the customers. They have their corporate offices right here in San Diego, which is where we camped out and helped them out. But they purchase everything. They contract manufacture the WD-40, the stuff in the oil that you buy at the supermarket or at Home Depot. They buy the packaging. They purchase and contract out all the distribution worldwide. And then out to all the customers, out to Home Depot and Walmart and Kmart and everybody else. That's all contract driven from their perspective. And until they can get control over it or be able to pull their suppliers and their distributors for their carbon footprint, it's going to be difficult for them, I think, to get above an F at this point. But I'm glad to see that they've made an effort.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, all companies are, this is a, like you said, across industries and sizes and legacy, a history. They're going to be moving in that direction for sure. So great example.
Very good. All right, thank you very much. Anybody else have any questions? We're getting to the end of the period. If nothing else, then I think we'll wrap it up. Preston, did you have any final comments, or Nick, any final comments?
No, I just enjoyed the presentation. It was very informative, and I really hope we can get Professor Burke back again, because I think her ability to present something and have us walk away with the big picture about an organization or a standard or a methodology is, she's got a skill. I enjoyed the session today or this evening. And I agree with Nick, who happened to be a student of hers, that she is a good teacher. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's attention and some great questions. Obviously a very insightful group. So well done. Thank you.